Hey everyone, I'm Jordy, and this is your guide to the hard mode version of the Assembly of Iron encounter in the Titan Complex Ulduar. Now, the Assembly of Iron, or Iron Council, is a 3-phase encounter with a set of 3 bosses that, when killed in a certain order, infuses the remaining mobs with power and new abilities that really ramps up their threat as the fight goes on. In this hard mode, we start with Stormcaller Brundir, followed by Runemaster Mulgheim, and finishing with the hulking Steelbreaker. I'll explain why we do the order this way during the fight, but suffice to say, it's important and I wouldn't recommend deviating. Okay, for this fight, we bring 5 healers, 2 tanks, and a good mix of ranged and melee DPS. Later in the phase, you could drop to 4 healers, but early on I recommend 5 as there's a large amount of raid damage going out and your Steelbreaker tank will get hit very hard. I'd also recommend whoever's tanking Steelbreaker for most of the fight to wear a bit of nature resistance. A helm or cloak enchant can go a long way to mitigating some of the fusion punch damage and some of the incidental raid damage as well. Hunters use Aspect of the Wild, Shamans Nature Res Totem. Just make sure that you have something to help soften that raid and tank damage. Alright, let's get into each mob's abilities. I want to mention, when one mob dies, the other 2 get healed to full, so don't bother trying to pad, as it's useless damage. Okay, first, and the first mob that you'll kill on hard mode is Stormcaller Brundir. This little guy casts a chain lightning that is interruptible, so make sure you kick it. Not too bad. He also periodically casts Overload, which does about 20,000 nature damage unmitigated and stuns everyone in an area around Brundir. It's pretty easy to avoid, just run out when he starts casting it. Next up, Runemaster Mulgheim, the second boss that you'll be killing. Runemaster Mulgheim places a couple different runes on the ground that do different things, and baiting and planning around them is the goal here. First, he'll place a blue rune on the ground called Rune of Power. This increases the damage of anyone, friendly or enemy, who is standing in it by 50%. He'll cast it underneath himself or his 2 friends at random, so if you're tanking Steelbreaker and you see a blue rune underneath him, you have to move him out of it or you will die. Constant vigilance is the play here. Otherwise, do your best to tank the bosses near the rune so the DPS can stand in it and blast the bosses using its buff. It's very powerful and is the key to finishing phase 3. Second, he'll periodically cast a buff on himself called Shield of Runes. This absorbs a bunch of damage, and once it's burned through, will give Mulgheim a buff that increases his damage by 50% for 15 seconds. If you see this shield up on the boss, your mages should spell steal it so they can utilize it against him. Finally, and most importantly, let's talk about Steelbreaker. Now, this guy hits really hard. I highly recommend a pally tank here for a couple reasons. First, you're going to occasionally find that when he's buffed by an unlucky Rune of Power, a clutch save by Ardent Defender can mitigate some bad RNG. Second, Steelbreaker uses an ability called Fusion Punch that deals 35,000 nature damage and applies a dot that deals 20,000 nature damage over 4 seconds that can be dispelled. The pally tank is the perfect person to dispel this, as he's tracking it the best, and as Steelbreaker is casting, he can start spamming dispel on himself. Second, Steelbreaker has a persistent damage aura called High Voltage that will hit your raid for 3,000 nature damage every 3 seconds, but is resistible. This just must be healed through. Okay, so that's all the boss's abilities outside of the ones that they gain during the fight when one of the others dies. I'm going to wait to go over those until we get into the actual strategy. Just know things get a bit more complicated once the bosses start to go down. Alright, so let's talk about the strategy. On pull, your 2 tanks will grab the mobs. Your Steelbreaker tank picks up Steelbreaker and Runemaster Mulgheim initially, while your off tank grabs Brundir and starts to threat hard to keep him ahead of the DPS. Once he's got a comfortable threat lead, that tank will then taunt Mulgheim off of the Steelbreaker tank to relieve him of that extra damage. The raid can stack on Brundir and DPS him, hoping for a Rune of Power every so often to help juice the DPS that they're doing. If a rune goes out beneath Steelbreaker, that tank must move the boss out of it as fast as possible. The Brundir tank should do his best to get Brundir towards it so that the raid can abuse its damage buff. One thing to note is that he can be death gripped onto the Rune of Power, which helps with uptime. Occasionally, Overload will go out, so avoid that damage if you want. We actually opted to just eat it, as it wasn't too bad to heal up from, but it's not necessary to. Keep interrupting Brundir, abuse the Runes of Power, and blast. Alright, phase 1 is done once Brundir goes down, and things start getting a bit more complicated. Each remaining boss is infused with power, increasing their damage done by 25%, and they now each gain a new ability. Rune Master Molgheim now casts Rune of Death. This is a massive green rune he'll cast on the ground underneath a player that deals 5,000 damage every half second to whoever is standing in it. If you see this underneath you, you must move out quickly or you'll absolutely die. Additionally, Steelbreaker gets an ability called Static Disruption. He'll briefly target a random person in the raid and hurl a ball of lightning at them, dealing about 9,000 to 12,000 nature damage, depending on buffs, and splashing to anyone within 6 yards. This also applies a debuff that increases nature damage taken by 75%. Now this can stack, which really sucks, so try not to take 2. This ability also has a very strong preference of targeting someone at range over melee, but if no ranged targets are available, it will hit a melee, and often wipe the raid. Okay, so Brundir is down, we move into phase 2, where damage really begins to ramp up. Positioning in this phase is key, as you want to avoid splashing Static Discharge unnecessarily and having too many people hit by a Rune of Death at any one time. We do our best to tank Molgheim near Steelbreaker to make good use of the Runes of Power, while the ranged and healers spread out 6 yards from each other as best they can. There's a decent amount of movement in this phase, so healers must keep an eye on where your tanks are and plan ahead to be in range if they need to move out of Runes of Power. At a couple points in this phase, you'll be waiting for a Rune of Death to go out. At this point, you want your melee to spread out away from the boss in order to avoid the unfortunate stacking of a Rune of Death and a Rune of Power. Your goal in this phase is to get Molgheim low enough to call for the kill, while having a Rune of Power just having been dropped so that you can use it in its entirety in phase 3 on Steelbreaker. You'll often find yourself getting Molgheim low and then having to wait 30 seconds to a minute before a good Rune of Power goes out. Once it goes out and your raid is ready to go, you call for the kill on Molgheim and move into phase 3. Now phase 3 is a race against the clock. As Runemaster dies, Steelbreaker gets another stack of the 25% damage increase buff and gains a couple more abilities. First, Overwhelming Power. His target will be infused with a 200% damage increase, but after 25 seconds will be instantly killed and deal a bunch of damage to anyone within range of him due to what's called a meltdown. Additionally, if anyone dies in this phase, the boss is healed by 40%. Which, when a healing reduction buff is up like Aim Shot or Mortal Strike, is reduced to 20%. So, as you transition, ideally with a fresh Rune of Power, we cast Pain Sup on the tank and begin to blast as hard as we can. This is where you lust, pop all your cooldowns, go absolutely ham on Steelbreaker. 3 healers are designated the Soakers for the Static Discharge. Spread out far enough away from each other that they won't splash the debuff when it hits them. As the tank gets Overwhelming Power, your off tank prepares to taunt the boss. At about 5 seconds until the buff expires, the second tank taunts and your first tank runs away from anyone else in the raid. This tank ideally has a Soul Stone, so that when he does eventually die at the end of the buff, he can pop back up and get back in there, waiting to taunt off tank number 2 when their debuff gets to 5 seconds. Damage is really ramping up here, because when anyone dies in this phase, the boss also gets another stack of ramping 25% damage, so after 2 deaths, you either need to kill the boss or you will likely die and heal him to full. If you've done enough damage before your tanks die and the raid begins to tick out, he'll go down and you can collect your loot. Congrats, that's one of the hardest fights in Ulduar. Alright, let's talk about some tank tips. Your Steelbreaker tank needs to be very aware of when a Rune of Power goes down and work to move him out of it as quickly as possible. It can be kind of fiddly, so work extra hard not to stand him on it so that he's not getting that damage buff. Also, work with your off tank to keep Steelbreaker and Runemaster Molgheim as stacked as possible, so that when a rune does go down, the melee can use it right away to blast the boss. Finally, on the transition between phase 2 and 3, use a cooldown like Shield Wall, and as you'll take a lot of damage from Steelbreaker that your healers may not be exactly ready for. Additionally, when Steelbreaker puts Overwhelming Power on you, look around and make sure you'll have somewhere to run that's safe and won't be near anyone else when you do eventually melt down. If anyone else dies except for you, it is very likely a wipe. Okay, some healer tips. This fight has a ton of ramping damage, so make sure you go into phase 2 and 3 with as much mana as you can. Phase 1's pretty chill overall, so don't waste cooldowns unnecessarily. Pay attention during phase 2 when Rune of Death is ready to be used. Your raid is going to take a bunch of damage, so calling for a DSAC here is a good use. Watch your positioning in phase 2 and 3. Make sure you're soaking those static discharges and don't stand so close to the tanks in phase 3. They need room to run away from the raid when their overwhelming power is about to expire. And finally, let's talk about DPS. In phase 2, you might have to stop DPS to wait for a new Rune of Power to drop before you push the phase 3 transition. Make sure you're not burning any cooldowns unnecessarily in this phase because you're going to need them to pump as best you can in phase 3. Additionally, raid damage is really high in phase 3 and your healers will have their hands full with a lot of tank healing, so any self saves you've got helps a lot. And for the mages, you need to get that spell stolen Rune of Shield to pop before you get that damage buff, so you might have to bake in a Rune of Death to get it when you want it. Finally, make sure before you call for the burn on Mulgheim to get your debuffs up on Steelbreaker like Sunder or Expose so that you can get full burn the second Mulgheim dies. Alright, well that's it for hard mode Iron Council. Congrats on downing a really tough hard mode. If you can do this one, I have no doubt you have what it takes for the rest of the hard modes in here. And that's it for me. If you enjoyed this guide, do me a favor and like this video and maybe toss me a subscribe. It helps me a lot and contributes to the further Ulduar boss guides. If you want to stop by and say hi or ask questions, feel free to head over to my Twitch at twitch.tv/Jordy. Okay, thanks everybody. See you in the next one.
Just send it the rest of the way.
Let's go.
Yeah,
Let's go.
Clean as fuck.
Get away from Necator.
I tried to stay still. I don't care. Worth.
Don't really.
Easy.
I got dairy.
Easy.